Hello, everyone. I can't talk. Welcome to our Tuesday Sew Along. We are doing block number 28. It's called Windblown Square. And I'd like to show it to you and talk a little bit about it before we get started on the components of it. It is basic units. This is review for most of you because these are units we've done before. It has flying geese. It has half squares that are hidden because they're right next to a matching color in the corners of the square squared unit. So there's a square square in the middle, four half squares, and then a flying goose. And we'll talk about how you assemble all of that. But let's just first of all talk about the basic assembly of those units. So the um, half squares, I've already put together the pieces that you need so that you can see how that's done. It starts with two squares. I have two red squares and two background squares. And I put them together. I've drawn my double lines using the Quilter's Magic Wand. And now we're already ready to cut that apart because I've already stitched it. I kind of skipped over some of the steps because they're steps we've done before. And this is the basic use of the Tucker trimmer to make half squares and then trim them down. So I'm letting the iron heat up while I'm cutting those apart. Move this over to the side. Then when you press it, remember to just kind of give it a little finger press. That gets the seams going the direction you want them to go. And you don't have to fight them and have them flip on you and not be going the direction you want them to go. And then I just set my iron on it. I would do that with all four of them. And then you're going to put, if you're using the acorn pressing pin, just give it a little swipe. And it doesn't take a lot of time. I don't spend a whole lot of time with it. I know some people use the acorn pressing pin and then they press down with the iron. I don't generally do that because I figure the heat of the iron is going to crease that back the way I want it to adequately. But my iron is heavy enough that I don't worry about that. Now, if you're using like the little mini irons, you may need to give it a little pressure to help get those seams flattened. I like those little mini irons, but they just don't put out the heat as a general rule. So I'm just going to give that a quick little press. And then it's ready to trim. So these are 4-inch finished units. That means I'm going to trim them. I said that wrong. These are 3-inch finished units. So I'm going to trim these to 3.5 inches. And I'm using the half circle icon up in the top right corner. The long diagonal line goes right on the seam. And I just want to center it on there so that I have just a tiny sliver all the way around to trim away. And I'm going to go up and across. And then when I turn it, I'm going to line up again. This time I've got the dashed lines that say 3.5 inches. That is going on my cut edges, so I know I have a true square. The diagonal line lands on that diagonal seam so that when I get that trimmed, I know that it is the precise size I want. The seams line up where they're supposed to, and the corners of that seam go right down into the corner of my square. So since I'm right-handed, that half circle icon goes on the right, top right corner of my unit. And I turn, I didn't quite cut through that, but I think I'll get it this time when I get there. I'll show you. Cut up and across, and often, mostly what you're cutting is those little ears that I would have cut anyway. I just missed that edge there. So now there's 2 of them trimmed up, and I would just complete that with all 4 units. If you are left-handed, simply turn your tool so that the half circle icon is at the top left of your square and line up the seam on that diagonal line. And you're going to cut up the left side and across that way. I'm not going to try that, but that's how you would trim if you were left-handed. So I've got 2 of my squares, and they would go here and here, and then I have 2 more that complete that. So let's go back to the sewing area and talk about how we would put together the square squared in the center. This is also review. So this is something that we've done before, and we're going to kind of walk through that. Let me get the right camera on. So I have my center square, and I have 2 squares that both of them are oversized. But when you get ready to do a square squared, you're going to trim the center square using the A section of your square squared. And on mine, I've got a glare where you can't see it. I have marked an A on the window templates. That's on the side of the ruler where it says the name of the tool. Also, I have the chart here that gives me the indicator of what size squares I need for those side triangles. This is a 6-inch finished unit, so I'm going to put the center for a 6-inch square, it's out here, on my square, and I'm going to true that up. Now, if my square is kind of wonky, I may need to trim all the way around. Mine is pretty good, so I'm just going to trim away 2 sides to true that up. So it tells me also on the square squared tool what size strip or square to start with. If I'm only making one, I can just use 1 square. And it tells me I need to start with a 5-inch strip right here on the tool. Since, say that again. Tony says my machine light's on. It makes a glare. I know that it makes it easier for me to see, but you can't see as well. So on this tool, it tells me right on the tool what size strips to start with. Now that would be if I'm making several square squares in this size. Since I'm just making one, I just cut 1 5-inch square and I trimmed off to match the window template. It also told me I need 4 1/4-inch squares that are going to be my side triangles. I've got 4 1/4-inch squares here, and you're just going to take some sort of a tool and lay it corner to corner, and we're going to go across diagonally so I end up with triangles. Now, when you get ready to stitch this, this was the most awkward thing that I did when I was working to learn how to use this effectively. The most awkward thing is put the square on top and put the triangle on bottom. You know, you've probably seen patterns that would tell you fold your square and pinch it, and fold your triangle and pinch it, and match up those little creases. You don't really have to do that. You just want to even up those edges. I don't know why it won't stay. There we go. Maybe that'll work better. And I just kind of eyeball it and make sure I have about an equal amount of triangle sticking out on both sides of my square. I'm using my 1/4-inch foot at the edge of my square because that one is cut to size. It's not going to get trimmed anymore after you trim it with that window template because it gives you the precise size. If you did the math, out exactly what size square you need for most of the center squares on those diamond square units. It's an odd measurement because you're actually measuring your square squared, your finished square squared, from point to point. So the measurement from this point to this point needs to measure your finished size, 6 inches in this case. But that means that the size I need to cut to fit in there is often not a size that's really even on my ruler. So the window template takes care of that issue, and I can just trim it to the precise size I need. So I've got 1 triangle on. I'm going to do the opposite side. And again, I just kind of center it on there so that I have about an equal amount of my triangles sticking out on both sides. And I'm going to stitch right along, aligning my foot with the edge of the square on top. And I just line up the raw edges and feed that through my machine. Now, if you're making several of these blocks, it would be more efficient to do assembly line sewing and do this step on all of your squared. I'm just making one, so I'm finished with this part of it. And then I'm going to give it just a little finger press. Since I'm only making one, I'm going to give it a good finger press, and I'm going to go ahead and sew the two remaining triangles on. If I had a bunch of them to do, I'd probably take the time to take it to the iron and press all of them, but I'm just doing one. So I'm just going to finger press it. You just want to make sure that when you finger press it, you get this seam flattened so that you don't end up with a little tuck here that you weren't aware of. That will affect your finished size, and it'll affect the looks of your block. So you don't want that. Again, I'm just centering my triangle on there so I have about an equal amount of the triangle sticking out on both sides, and it's going to overlap. And by the way, if you don't flip those first triangles back before you sew this triangle on, you're going to have to get your seam ripper because you'll lock down those first triangles if you don't crease them back. Once you get to the other side, I'm going to grab my fabric tag and I'm going to cut it in half. I generally have two fabric tags laying around, and I just go from one to the other, and I'll park my needle, and I'm going to grab the other one and line them up. Again, just make sure you have about an equal amount of the triangle sticking out on both sides. And I get it started, and once I get 2 or 3 stitches in, my needle is in the down position so that I can adjust here. And that's my typical way of stitching. I don't do a lot of pinning if I can get by without it, but I know a lot of people like to pin, which is fine. But for this step, I just control it by getting it started and then just let my needle stay in the down position. So there's my squared unit, and we're ready to go trim that. So we're going to go to the overhead camera so you can see what that looks like. I see lots of people from all over. I've got some from Florida, some from St. Louis, Pea Ridge, so Georgia. Yeah, we have all kinds of states represented, which is always fun. Of course, we have Oklahoma. So for those of you that don't know, we're only about 2 miles from Oklahoma. But I know that our Oklahoma viewers are a little farther than that. So I finger pressed it while I was chatting, and I didn't even basically tell you that I was doing it. And now I'm going to give just a little acorn pressing pin all the way around. Notice on this particular color, you can see where the acorn pressing pin has been. That's not always true. Sometimes I swipe it across there and there's nothing that shows. And when I first started using the acorn products, I would swipe it 2 or 3 times till I could see that little wet spot that the solution made. And all it did was cause me to have a little bit of scorch marks on my iron. And I called them and she said, "You're using too much. You don't have to see it for it to work." So now I want to trim this up to 6 inches. On my tool, I'm looking for all the X's that say 6. That's my intersections on my squared. So I'm going to put all of those X's, my number 6 X's, on the intersections, and I want to just center that on there. If I've done a good job with trimming the center and sewing and aligning the edges, those lines will line up on my seams. And then I'm ready to trim. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to trim up the right side and across the top. Left-handed, you would actually start with your tool vertically like this. So you're going to turn 180 degrees, and my tool is horizontal because I am right-handed. And this time, the line right here aligns for my 6.5 inches, and the edges of my tool on these 3 sides make the other lines for my 6.5 inch square. So that will finish at 6 inches. So there's my squared for the center of my block. And of course, your colors may be totally different than mine. I'm going to show you some other color combinations in a minute. So the only other unit we need for this block, I'm going to take these two out so that we're just left with the 4 half squares we need. We need 4 flying geese, and I'm going to stick this in the middle just so you can see it. So the 4 flying geese, this is our basic wing clipper instructions. In your packaging, it'll tell you what size you need to start with. For this particular size, all you have to do is look at the sheet that tells you what size squares to cut. So for this, I had to have a 7.5-inch square for my geese and some 4-inch squares for my sky. Let's go to the chart just to kind of review. So this chart, oh, okay. Tell me to come back to that. Um, well, Tony is telling me something, a comment that was made. There is a large square squared, and I've talked about it before, but it's been a while, and there may be people on here who haven't seen this. So let's talk about it just a minute. And of course, it's down here in my drawer, so I'll get it out so you can see. The large square squared is designed, of course, to make larger units. It is so big that it has to have 2 pieces of plastic to have the information in your cutting area. So you have an A tool, and it's even marked part A, and then you have a B tool to do all of your trimming. And when we first were talking about that, that would have been how big the tool was. That's a lot of tool to have to handle. But let me show you some things you can do with the large square squared. First of all, the original size, the one I used to do my center unit, will do a 1-inch, 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch, 5-inch, and 6-inch. So it will do 6 sizes, all whole measurements. The large square squared will do those same 6 plus 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So it'll do 12 sizes. There's also even a new one that does half sizes. So it'll finish 5.5, 6.5, 7.5, and so on. But for this one, here's what a lot of people like to use the large square squared for. First of all, like I said, you could do this size and all the way down to a 1-inch with that tool. But it is designed, I'm trying to turn this over so you see the right thing first. It's designed so you could center something in the middle of your square squared unit. It would be the right size. You would know what size triangles to put on the side. So if you like to embroidery, if you like to applique, you could feature something inside. So this one finishes at 11 inches. This one finishes at 8 inches. This is a 6-inch one, so it's the same size as the one we did for the center of our block. So I could have actually used a plain background, appliqued or embroidered something in the center of that block for a really kind of a snazzy center of that block. So not only can you do a plain square and a square, many of you saw the economy blocks we did, and we had a quilt we called Economizer. It's a square inside of a square inside of a square. And so you can do a single square and a square. You can do a double. You can do and it's called a stack square. It's a technique sheet. So you could have a single stack, a double stack, or if you're really hungry, you could have a triple stack. And that's a square and a square, and it just keeps getting bigger. The stacked square is also the same units that you need to make the snail's trail block. Typically, it would have a little 4 patch in the center. This one, I put a square and a square in the center, and it finishes at 1 inch, this little bitty one. And then I've also got a pattern that I did called Lemoyne Trails, and I used an hourglass in the center. So there's lots of different centers you can put in. With the square square tool, you can also do a bird of paradise, and there's a couple of examples of the bird of paradise technique. And this pattern is a pineapple block done with the large square squared. So it just gives you more options for sizes of units that you can make. And we do carry all of the tools. We have the large square squared, the original square squared. We also have the half size square squared. And also, some of the people are surprised because the square squared original, it was named square to the second power. You may have seen it. It had a square with a little two. That, and I think mine still, the one that I use now. Nope, mine actually says square squared. When they updated several years ago, they changed that from square two to square squared. But think back to middle school math where you had to do, I don't know what they called it, to the second power is all I remember. But it is the tool that is our square squared that makes that diamond square. If you get emails, or I think it was also on Facebook from Studio 180 Design, she had a um, post last week, or maybe it was the week before, about the diamond square. That's what she's talking about, this square inside of a square, because generally it's on point. Of course, you could put it in a quilt where it was like that, but generally it's a diamond square. So that's kind of where that all came from. So let's talk a little bit about the wing clipper for those of you who haven't looked at it in a while or just would like to review. This is the chart that I often show when I'm demonstrating, just to kind of remind you. We start with one large square and four small squares. And on the side, up at the top right side of this chart, it tells you that you're looking at the height of the goose and the width of the goose, and that determines how big you need to start your squares with. So for a 3 by 6 inch flying goose, that's what we have. I need my big square to start 1.5 inches bigger. So that means it has to be 7.5 inches. The 3 inch determines the size of my small squares. And so since it's a 3 inch finished, I have to start 1 inch bigger. And so I have 4 inch squares. I've already drawn my double lines on. I don't know if you can see that in the light. So I've used my Quilter's Magic Wand. This one I had to use the whole long one because I couldn't get my little one to go across. But my Quilter's Magic Wand has gone across and I've drawn both lines on. So this is one reason I didn't sew this ahead of time. I wanted you to see kind of how I did this. When I'm doing flying geese, I generally don't pin them either. I'm going to align the first small square on top of the large square. And notice I'm leaving 3 or 4 threads of that back square showing. If you feel the need to pin this, you certainly could, and then start sewing. I don't, but some people would rather pin and they feel a little more secure. So once I get that in place, my doesn't want to stay put. I don't know what the deal is. So once I get this in place, I start stitching on my lines. We're just going to line that up. And I'm going to stitch, a little more than halfway across. And then I'm going to grab the second one. This is one reason why I draw my lines just on my small squares before I align them on my large squares. Some people would pin both small squares on and then draw their lines all the way across. I don't feel the need to do that. And then when I get that second square on there, see how the lines overlap? There are actually lines on that underneath part of my first square as well. But I just line that up so that my two lines overlap each other, and I'm just going to keep sewing. And you just want to make sure that you're also leaving that little space on the back end of this square so that when you get that fed through, you have just a little bit of your larger square showing at the outside edge. So I just hold that in place, get it all the way across. And if you're making a bunch of flying geese, I would of course do this assembly line style. That's always more efficient and saves you thread, saves you snarls of thread on your piecing. So I just always do assembly line piecing if I can. And notice I just stitched across the end and I start coming back the other direction. That's my typical way of doing this process. There's all sorts of techniques of different things you can do with your wing clipper tool and units you can make. But for this basic unit, this is how I go about the process. So I've got 2 small squares stitched in a double line across my large square. I'm going to the cutting area and the sewing area, the pressing area, so you can see what happens. Let me move this out of my way. And I can move my large square tools out of the way. And I'm going to just grab some sort of a tool that I can line up point to point. And I'm actually on my wing clipper tool. There's a little dashed line right here that is actually 1/4 of an inch from the edge. I can actually put that on my seam that I stitched, and I can get even seam allowances that way. Now on this step, you're going to press toward the smaller triangle. There are a lot of people that have started pressing their seams open, which you could, but I still press toward the smaller triangle on this step. And I'm just going to give it a finger press. Notice I'm not just dragging my finger all the way across. I'm doing little short motions because I don't want to stretch any of that bias edge out of shape. Set the iron on it and let it get hot. And then I'm going to grab my acorn pressing pin and give it a swipe down those seams. And by the way, if your acorn pressing pin nib is all messed up, that can be replaced. We have them here at the shop. You can buy a package of 5 or we'll sell you just one. And they're very easy to replace. Let me show you how hard it is. Pull that out and put a new one in. That's all there is to it. And then if you feel like it's not flowing, just push on the little nib and it causes the little spring to scoot back so that it'll get a little bit of the solution on it. Now I'm ready to add the next square. So we're going back to the sewing area. And I'm going to remember, first of all, to align my square, my small square on the corner. And again, I want to scoot away from the corner, just 2 or 3 threads, just enough to get it where I see that back square. And I like to sew from the corner to the 2 triangles. It actually probably wouldn't matter which direction you sewed. I just do that so I don't forget to leave that little bit of space on my square. And again, I'm going to line that up. If you feel like you need to pin it, you certainly could, but I just don't on this step. Okay. I have no bobbin thread. Hang on a second. I thought about that earlier today when I was stitching something else. I thought I should probably look, but of course I didn't. And guess what? This is not the same color as my top thread, but I don't really care because it's going to be in the seam and I'm not going to see it and neither will you. If your machine tension is properly set, you should not see any thread if you're pressing to the side. Oh, I got to close that door. It'll start beeping at me. I'm going to turn, go across the end, and come back the other way. And notice you can see where I've left that little bit of space on that large square. That's the step. If people forget a step in flying geese, that's the step they forget. So if your geese are not trimming like you think they should, check and make sure that you are leaving that little bit of space. So I'm going to park my needle and I'm ready to go to the ironing station, iron this and trim it. And I'll show you what that looks like. So again, I'm just going to grab my wing clipper tool and I'm lining up from point to point, but I've got that little dashed line there. I can put that right on the seam so that makes it even. Grab the other one. Now this is going to be a 3x6 finished goose. That means I need to trim it to 3.5 by 6.5. But first we're going to press it. Give it just a little finger press. The iron's still hot, so I'm just going to give them all just a quick little finger press so that the seams are aiming the way I want them to. And notice they kind of overlap. And I do this all of the time when I'm pressing like units. That way it gives it a little bit of extra time under the iron, gives it just a little bit of time with the heat. Once I get the seams flattened a little bit with the heat, then I'm just going to give it just a little swipe with the acorn pressing pin. And notice it doesn't take a lot of time, but that will make a huge difference in your piecing. The reason is if you've ever used starch, like a spray bottle of starch, even Best Press, which I like really well, if I took the Best Press and I spritzed this unit, I can distort the outside edge, which would probably be okay in this state. But if I have already trimmed it and then I spritz it, sometimes I can distort it where it doesn't really fit the shape I want. So here is what I look for. I have this long diagonal line that will always go on the right seam of my goose. The first thing I did was lay the goose down pointing toward me. Then one of these lines, the diagonal lines here that match up to the different sizes, will line up on the left line, left seam. If I put this in place and I've got my right line aligned on my seam and I pick one on my left seam, you can tell pretty quickly that's not the right one because I have way too much out here that's going to get trimmed away. If I get it here, and you can see there's nothing to trim, I can tell I don't have it in the right spot. So I want to find the one that fits the best. This one fits the best, and there's just a tiny bit of space beyond the edge of the tool and beyond the 3.5 by 6.5 inch line. So I just line that up where it's as even as possible, trim up, trim over, and then I'm going to turn 180 degrees. The 3.5 by 6.5 go on my cut edges, and that will also leave a bold little X at the top, so I don't worry about chopping off my goose's beak. And I'm going to trim up and over, and that's the process for trimming flying geese. I'm going to show you real quickly one more. If you are left-handed, you're going to point your geese to the right. You're going to turn your tool so that this long diagonal line lines up with the top seam, and then you'll find the matching line here. You're going to be trimming up the long side over here on the left and across. So that's the process for trimming. I'll do one more right hand one. I'm not going to take the time to trim them all because I want to show you how you assemble the block, because it's another one of those fun partial seams. It's one of my favorite techniques because it kind of gives you a chance to do a little trickery. It's kind of smoke and mirrors, but because once you get it done, it fits very nicely and you know that it's going to be what you want it to end up. But I did want to show you, remember, you can put the components of this block together however you want. It has this kind of whirly gig in the center that the half square matching up with the triangle on the squared in the middle. But when I first laid this up here this afternoon, I just kind of slapped it up here, and this is the way I arranged it. There's nothing that says you can't put your block together that way. Move that out where it looks right. So you don't have to assemble the components the way I would. Um, let's see. Cheryl asked a question and I'm reading it real quick. Under the downloads, there is no nudge sheet with a bit larger sizes. You trim a bit more as well. There, that is one thing that you'll notice. Uh, Depending on the size unit you're making, if you've made several units in all the different sizes, you're going to find some sizes have a little more that you're going to trim away than others. Well, I call it a little more wiggle room. I like those best, but there should be plenty. If you're having issues, call me because usually I can tell you over the phone what the issue is. Okay, so this is how I want to put the block together. So my first step is to assemble the flying geese with those half squares because I want to make a rectangle out of that. So I'm going to take this whole thing to the sewing area and show you what that's going to look like. There are also, if there is a nudge sheet, she's talking about instructions for how to align things when you're trimming. If there at one time was a sheet that gave you information that was helpful and you can no longer find it, write them an email because sometimes they remove things or change things and they may just need to give you the idea of where to look for it. So I am aligning the seam of my half square with the seam of my flying goose. Now, if I wanted to, I could flip this seam so that these two seams would nest. If I do that, that means this seam is going toward the light fabric in my half square. I'm not going to do that today. You can if you want to on your units when you're putting them together. So I'm just going to line that up and I'm going to stitch and make rectangles. And I need 4 rectangles. So I've got one. I'm going to grab the next one. And you want to make sure that they're all oriented the same way. So in this case, my goose is pointing down and the half square is right next to it so that I end up with all 4 of my rectangles being oriented the same. Now you can put them however you want. You don't have to assemble yours in the same order that mine are. And I'm going to do that with all 4 of these. And like I said, I want to make sure that they are all leaning the same direction because that's what goes around my center, my square squared in the center. Now, notice I am pinning. I just got to thinking, I don't pin a lot, but sometimes you have to keep the seams aligned the way they need to be for whatever you're working on. And notice I'm pinning right into the seam and I'm coming out of the seam. You can't see that on this side because the color of the fabric is camouflaging the color of the thread. That up. And then I'm going to park my needle. Now at this point you have to make a decision about which way to press your seams since you've got a little bit of bulk there in the corner, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let me get rid of my pins so I can show you. By the way, that pin is ready for the trash. Just saying. Okay, so I have to decide, do I want to press open? Do I want to press toward the half square? Or do I want to press toward the goose? Since they are about equal in bulk, I'm choosing to press open, and I'm just giving it a quick little finger press open. And often when I'm assembling a block, I finger press the components and I don't go to the iron until I get the whole block assembled. So it may be laziness on my part. I don't know that there's a real good reason why I do that, but sometimes I feel like I distort less if I get everything aligned and then I press everything. So I want to do that same unfinished or partial seam technique that we talked about last week. I'm going to put this all here and then show you again. All of these are facing, the flying geese are facing the center. See if I can get this out here where you can see it. So my first one that I'm going to align is here on the left seam of my center square. So I'm going to grab that and put it here where you can see it. So when I get started, the point here needs to match up with that seam. And I'm going to flip this over, and I pressed that open, just finger pressed the seam open. But I'm going to pin, let me get this down here where you can see where I'm pinning. This is one of the few places I would pin. I'm going to pin right into the intersection. I got another pin that's destined for the trash. Right at that intersection, I want to insert my pin there. And then I can peek through and I can see that my pin needs to be just a hair different because it needs to come out right at the intersection on the inside. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with that. There we go. So right there where that intersection is, that's where that pin needs to come out. I don't know that you can see it in the camera. But now I want my pin to go right into the seam. It's a little unfocused. There it is. I want that pin to go right in that seam. And I'm going to just line that up. And I'm going to basically align the edges. And my placement pin, that's the first pin, I'm just going to hold it with my fingertips and slide a stabilizing pin in there. Then I'm going to take out that first pin. So once I get started, I'm going to stitch a little more than halfway, and I want to make sure I stitch this intersection so I can get that laying down the way I want it to. Once I get stitched a little bit better than halfway, I'm going to align the end. I'm going to stitch a little more, and then I'm going to back up, and I'm going to cut my thread. So you get to choose whether you want to press open or to the side. Let me take this pin out. On this particular block, I would choose to press open. The reason is I'm going to have a little bit of bulk here in this seam, but I'm also going to have a little bit of bulk on this seam when I get down here. So I'm just going to flip this over, give it a little finger press, and I'm not going to take the time to go to the iron, but now I can put this unit on and I can stitch all the way across. But I have two places I need to match up. I need to match here to there, and I need to match here to there. So I'm going to flip this over, and it almost doesn't matter which seam I pin first, but I'm going to pin here and then peek under here and pin right into that intersection and just buddy those up to where they are matched and slide the stabilizing pin out. Take out my first pin, my placement pin. There I'm going to go right into the intersection at the tip of my goose. And this seam, remember, is pressed open. So there is actually a little triangle there that I'm headed for that I'm going to match up. Pin right into that intersection and wiggle it around till they match up. And slide another pin in. Now, if you have a lot of bulk right here in that seam, from the pin to the next pin, you got a problem and something didn't get trimmed properly. It should match up exactly. So I'm going to get a fabric tag to sew off of and sew all the way across. And I want to hit the intersection here. You can't really see it with the color of thread I've used. And here I'm going for a 1/4 inch in because that's where the point of that other seam that's underneath is. And I lined up out here. Notice I didn't pin out here. I didn't really feel the need to, but if you want to, you certainly could. And I'm just going to stitch all the way across, part my needle, and I'm going to cut my fabric tag off, take out my pins, and it's gone all the way across. Again, I'm going to press that seam open, and I'm not going to take the time to stitch all of this because I want to show you something else, but I would stitch on, this rectangle next, all the way across, and I would match up here and here, here and here. Then I would stitch all the way across this one, match up the points that need to meet, and then I would go back and finish this first seam where I had the partial seam. Hopefully that helped you and it makes sense with what we talked about with the partial seam last week. If you need to go back and watch the video from last week where I stitched the whole partial seam, the whole thing about a partial seam is generally it's a square in the middle with 4 rectangles around the outside. And it is to avoid having to do a Y seam or a set-in seam. So I did want to show you some other color combinations. This is the color combinations from the instructions that you'll download from the Studio 180 Design website. Mine was most like the one there on the right, but the other 2 blocks are exactly the same block in exactly the same arrangement. It's just that the flying geese on the first one on the left actually has 2 different color wings. That's a whole nother lesson. But it is doable. The one in the middle, the seam across what looks like the flying goose in the middle is kind of obscured by the fabric, but it's actually the exact same block that you just saw me stitch with the blue and the red. So any questions that I need to deal with? Okay, so what she's talking about is the nudge sheet where it was talking about flying geese. I make flying geese in all the different sizes. There are a few people out there that have started cutting their small square bigger, an 1/8 inch bigger, but I don't really want to have to do that. Or maybe they do it a 16th. I'd have to look and see because they don't want to have to do the nudge. I figure I just nudge it a little bit and you do it enough and you kind of get a feel for how many threads in you need to put that small square, and it works out really well. So block 28 for this week. Next week we'll meet and we're actually going to skip a block because remember I'm not doing any of the blocks that don't work easily into a 12-inch block and the blocks that are the specialty star tools, Lemoyne Star, Hunter Star, Wedge Star, and Star 60. Those are a whole nother thing. So we're only doing fundamental blocks here. So until next week, happy sewing. Come see us. We've got a bunch of new fabric that came in today and several things that have been shipped that should be here sometime in the next few days. So we've got lots of new things for you to see. And happy sewing. Come see us. Bye-bye.